In a recent video called Bigger Than the Beatles, I discussed how I felt that their music alone was not enough to account for their stratospheric success. In the comments section, however, there were many comments where people talked about their experience of hearing the Beatles for the first time, not knowing who they were, and immediately being hooked by the simple power of the music. Loads of people actually disagreed with me and said that for them, the quality of the Beatles' music alone was enough to justify their unbelievable global success. So, while that video focused on the hype and promotion side of things, today I want to ask that exact same question, but focused on the music. What did the Beatles have in their songwriting that was unique and set them apart? In that previous video, I talked about the first time I heard Drive My Car by the Beatles and my incredibly negative reaction to it before I knew who was actually singing it. But in that video, I didn't actually mention the flip side of that coin, because there were actually multiple Beatles songs that I heard for the first time as a young man with no idea who was singing them, and was absolutely blown away by the quality and power of the songwriting. Those tunes include Hey Jude, I'm Only Sleeping, If I Fell, Yesterday, Fool on the Hill, and many more. Each one of those I heard and loved before I knew anything about the authors. And here's the really interesting thing about that. As an adult musician, I can look back over that selection of songs I just mentioned and immediately notice they all actually have something in common. Every single one of those songs was written using a specific songwriting technique that has all but disappeared from popular music today. So in this video, I want to explain that songwriting technique because it was at least part of what made their music so magical to so many people worldwide on a first listen. But I do want to explain it in the most simplified, jargon-free way I can possibly manage. If you're trained in music theory, you'll know all the technical terms for the various things I'm about to describe. But I'm intentionally not getting into any academic language if I can avoid it, because I want this video to make sense to young songwriters with no music theory training. But first of all, for the Beatles' lost songwriting technique to make sense, I first have to explain the very basics of songwriting. So let's start right at the beginning. If the guitar has a key, it's probably G. This is the G major scale. There's 7 notes in it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then we're back to 1 again. And that major scale shape I've just shown you there is basically the skeleton around which all the most simple songwriting is built. Each of those 7 notes I just showed you, G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, and then back to G again, each of those has a chord that goes with it. So G, it's a regular G, A, it's A minor, then B minor, C, D, E minor, and the one that goes with chord 7 is very rarely used. It's a diminished chord, and because it's so rarely used, I'm just going to leave it out of this video to keep things simple. So if we wanted to write a very simple beginner's song in the key of G, we would have those 6 or 7 chords to play with. In pop music today, however, this is already the full extent of how pretty much every song is written. It literally never gets more complicated than what I just showed you. And just to double check, today I actually listened through the UK top 10, and not one single song moved beyond the basic 7 chords. Okay, the songs were in different keys, but in practice all that means is you just use the same 7 chords and just put a capo somewhere on the neck, and you can play every single song in the whole of the UK top 10 from start to finish. I think it's fair to say that pop music has become utterly infantile in the past 20 years or so. And I also think that's part of why everyone seems to think that music today is just absolutely shit. But it wasn't always this way. Compare that to the chord sequences that the Beatles and the Kinks were putting together in the 60s. Compare it to the chord sequences that Noel Gallagher and James Dean Bradfield were making in the 90s. Just listen to the chords to Suicide Drive on the Seahorses debut album and compare it to the charts now, and you can hear how badly and how far we have regressed. The British music scene has fallen a very, very long way. no amount of technological pyrotechnics can make up for the song itself simply not being good enough. And that's the fascinating thing about listening to the Beatles. They didn't have any of today's technological wizardry. They didn't even record using a click. For the first half of their careers, their music was incredibly raw and simple, very sparse arrangements, and often many mistakes just left in the mix. And yet they were still the biggest band that ever lived. That's because they knew what the main thing was and what just the decoration was. The arrangements and musicianship are just the icing. They are not the cake. The main bulk, the important part, is the quality of the song. So now let's take a closer look at John Lennon and Paul McCartney, how they learned their songwriting craft and what they chose to focus on and become masters at. When Lennon and McCartney were young, they weren't obsessed with smartphones, the internet, or video games. None of those things existed yet. They were obsessed with their guitars, with singing and songwriting. Today, when someone gets really into guitar, it's quite often actually because they want to learn something really flashy and wild like Cliffs of Dover, Crossroads or Highway Star. It's often about lead guitar. In the Beatles' teenage years, however, they seem to have been much more interested and kind of fascinated with chords, to the point that they literally travelled all the way across Liverpool on the bus with their guitars because they had heard that a bloke on the other side of the city knew how to play a chord they didn't know, B7.
In fact, sometimes we'd travel the whole of Liverpool just to go to someone who knew a chord we didn't know. Remember once hearing about a bloke who knew B7. Now, we knew E and we knew A. It was quite easy, but we didn't know B7. We didn't know B7. That was kind of the missing part of the link, the other chord, the lost chord. So on we got on the bus, trooped across Liverpool, changed a couple of buses, found this fella, and he showed us dum, 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 B7. We learned it off him, got back on the bus, went home to our mates and went, zing, got it.
After they were signed, the scramble to the top, songwriting-wise, continued. And the boys who travelled all the way across Liverpool to just learn one new chord now had access to this man, George Martin. And you start to see the impact of that happy meeting on their songwriting very shortly after they first met. Their earliest official songs were written before meeting George Martin, and those appeared on their first album, Please Please Me, on which Lennon and McCartney wrote 8 of the 14 songs. And those 8 songs were already far more advanced than anything in the UK top 10 today. Even in the ultra-simplistic Love Me Do, we see something outside of the boring usual chords. They were using extended chords, meaning, for example, using an E7 instead of just a regular E. And that is the second rung of the songwriting ladder, incorporating chords with a number after their name for a little more colour and depth. But that's not all. By Please Please Me, they were also doing what I consider the third rung of the ladder, and that is including chords outside of the usual 7. Let's look at I Saw Her Standing There as an example. This song is in E. So the 7 chords in that key are E, F sharp minor, G sharp minor, A, B, C sharp minor, and that 7th chord that doesn't really get used. But in that song, we get a chord that is none of those 7. Here's a very simplified and dropped an octave version. How could I dance with another? That's the non-diatonic chord. That's the C that doesn't belong in this key. The 4th rung of the ladder is something I call genre swapping. And that's where you take one of the basic 7 chords, say a D, and you flip it from major to minor, or the other way round. And of course the Beatles were already doing this by the time of Please Please Me. In the song Ask Me Why, which is in the key of E, they change chord 3 from a G sharp minor into a G sharp major. In fact, there is not one single original Lennon and McCartney song on Please Please Me that doesn't utilise at least one of these chord techniques. Not a single one of them is as crap and simplistic as everything in the charts today. But we still haven't hit on the most important technique, the one this video is really about, and that is the 5th rung of the ladder. And that's because, in my opinion, at this time they hadn't actually mastered it yet on Please Please Me. That being said, there is one tiny little place on that first album, on Please Please Me, where we get a kind of hint of what was to come. The next step on the ladder, and it's track 11, Do You Want to Know a Secret? There is a fairly badly done middle section in this song around the 1 minute 10 mark. It lasts for just 5 bars, in which Paul McCartney also plays a couple of duff notes on the bass. It's shoddily written and poorly executed, but this is the first time on an official release, I think, that the Beatles began to break out of writing songs in the same key and began to just dip their toes into the next step on the ladder, key changes. Now, before you roll your eyes and go, I know about key changes, hang on. When most people think of key changes post-1980s, they tend to imagine a song like Living on a Prayer by Bon Jovi. That song is just in the same key for the whole thing, and then right at the end it changes up into a higher key for a kind of climactic chorus. And yes, that is a kind of key change, but it's one of the least subtle, and it's not one the Beatles really used. It was just a matter of a few short years before they were weaving constant key changes in and out of the body of their songs, often several times in one single line. So, I'm going to change the name of that fifth step. It's not really key changes per se, it's subliminal key changes, ones that the untrained listener doesn't even recognise are there. It's key changes woven into the chords and vocal melody with absolute brilliance and finesse, whilst simultaneously also still using all of the previous 4 techniques as well. The next song to be released after Please Please Me was From Me to You, and Lennon and McCartney's key-changing ability had improved by this time. The bridge of that song switches into a completely different key in quite a smooth way that the average listener simply doesn't even notice. So, let me demonstrate this for you. I'm going to only use those bog-standard, super simple chords in G. And then, when the key change happens, I'm just going to put the capo on so you can visually see where that shifting key occurs. If there's anything that you want, if there's anything I can do, just call on me and I'll send it along with love from me to you. I've got arms that long to hold you and keep you by my side. I got lips that long to kiss you and keep you satisfied. So there you can see, by that middle section where the capo appeared, there was a short period in that song where the key just completely changed. And a hell of a lot of listeners, musicians included, don't even realise that key change is there. Now, do you remember that actually incomplete list of songs that I mentioned towards the beginning of this video? Those songs I heard with no context, without knowing who the band was, but got instantly hooked by the brilliance of the music? Every single one of those Beatles songs used this technique. Subtle and often unnoticeable key changes just woven in to the fabric of the song. And that's what I want to show you today, how to actually do this in your songwriting. Do you want to have people listening to your music and falling in love with it before they know anything about the person who recorded it? If you want to have a chance at repeating what the Beatles did, you at least need to have this skill in your arsenal because it was part of theirs. So, how did the Beatles actually change key in the middle of a song? They had various techniques. Sometimes, as with From Me to You, they would just abruptly switch keys with no real announcement or transition tricks. They would just be playing in the first key for a while and then would just abruptly switch to the next one. I Want to Hold Your Hand is another great example of this, where they just unceremoniously just change key in the middle of the song. And once again, I'll just demo that for you now using the really simple bog standard G shapes and the capo. So that's quite a prominent early technique that the Beatles would use, just abruptly changing key in the middle of the song. And to be honest, it works fine. But as time passed, they got a little more sophisticated, and another trick they would use is the major-minor switch. Meaning, for example, if they were in E major for the verses, they might switch to E minor for the choruses. Norwegian Wood is a really good example of this, and I'll demo that now with very simplified chords. I once had a girl, or should I say, she once had me. She showed me her room, isn't it good, Norwegian Wood. She asked me to stay and she told me to sit anywhere. So I looked around and I noticed there wasn't a chair. So there you can see we just went from E major straight into E minor, again just abruptly with no real announcement or transition. While My Guitar Gently Weeps from the White Album is another great example of this major-minor switch. But this song does it the other way around. So the verses are in A minor, and then it switches straight over into A major for the choruses. The Paul McCartney masterpiece, Fool on the Hill, also does this, switching from C major in the verses to C minor in the choruses, and then back again. Abruptly switching from one key to the next and using the major-minor switch are actually pretty straightforward and easy to do. The hardest thing for someone who's new to this will actually be getting your head into the right key. If you're still hearing the original key in your mind, it can be quite hard to get yourself into the new one, but it does get easier and easier with practice. But now we come to the main seamless key change technique I want to talk about that the Beatles used all the time. And this is something I'm calling the 2-5 turnaround. I've already mentioned a few times in this video that every key has just 7 basic chords. In G it's G, A minor, B minor, C, D, E minor and F sharp diminished. The 2-5 turnaround is basically taking chords 2 and 5, so A minor and D, from the key you want to go into and just slapping them in the middle of a song. And if you get it right, it tricks the mind and the ear into subliminally, unconsciously transitioning into the new key. So I'm now going to attempt to imperfectly demonstrate this with a song everyone knows. I'm going to go into the chorus of Wonderwall by Oasis from the bridge, and at the very last moment I'm going to put the capo on and do the 2-5 switch. I'm going to play A minor and D in a different key, and let's see if it works. Let's see if we can trick our ears even on a song that everyone knows and that doesn't contain any key changes. I'm going to play the bridge of Wonderwall without a capo, and then I'm going to do the 2-5 switch with a capo on 5. There are many things that I would like to say to you, but I don't know how. Because maybe you're gonna be the one that saves me. Works, doesn't it? All I needed was my head in the right key, and it just clicks over like magic. Now obviously it's not practical to just whack a capo on your guitar mid-song, so you've just got to figure out what the chords are called and another way to play them without the capo. So now I'll do that Wonderwall key change without the capo using open chords. There are many things that I would like to say to you, but I don't know how. Because maybe you're gonna be the one that saves me. I absolutely love that key change in Wonderwall. I think that sounds as good as the original or better. So there we've used the 2-5 turnaround to get from the key of G into the key of C. But which other keys does that work for? Well, this is the really fun part. Over the bridge of Wonderwall, we're holding a long note over the word how. That note is here on the guitar, and that note is A. So we're going to treat that note as a kind of pivot point. All we need to do is find which other major scales use it, and then we can transition into any of them. This is the 2/5 transition from G into the key of A.
There are many things that I would like to say to you, but I don't know how. Because maybe you're gonna be the one that saves me.
Works fine in A. There is an A in the B flat major scale, so let's see if we can use the 2/5 transition into that key.
There are many things that I would like to say to you, but I don't know how. Because maybe you're gonna be the one that saves me.
Not bad, perhaps not as smooth as the A, but not bad. So I demoed all those changes there just using A minor and D and a capo. In reality, you'd need to figure out what those chords actually are, whether open chords or bar chords, and play those versions. But I used the capo just to illustrate how simple it really is. If you can just play A minor and D, you're leading the ear into whatever new key you want to use. And so, to finish, I want to show you an abridged version of how the Beatles would use this 2/5 technique and some of the other techniques we've talked about in one very short song, multiple times, often within the body of just one line of lyrics. So I'm going to demo for you now a short version of the song Here, There and Everywhere from Revolver. And I'll put the text up on screen to explain what key changes are happening and when. And just for the sake of this video, I've decided to start the song in E rather than G. Here we go. And you may have noticed that by the time of writing this song, McCartney was so good at changing keys, he often didn't actually need the 2/5, he only needed the 5. And the more you train your mind and your ears to hear different keys and break out of the confines of the toddler level of music on the radio, soon you too might be able to do the same. And so, that's it. A layman's introduction to the lost songwriting techniques of the Beatles. There is, of course, much more to it than I've covered today, but hopefully what we've talked about here should spark some ideas and fuel a little bit of inspiration in any aspiring rock stars out there. If you can start to incorporate these things into your songs, in this day and age, you really might actually stand a chance of sticking out from the crowd and drawing people into your music, simply from the power of the music alone. It's a very, very rare thing in the 2020s, but if you have that rock and roll dream to actually equal or become bigger than the Beatles, you have to become obsessed with chords and melody, just as they were. You need to learn from everyone you possibly can and not be too proud or cocky to study a bit of music theory, just as McCartney did at his earliest opportunity. Very best of luck to you, have fun playing around with those 2/5 transitions, and as always, I'll see you next time.